What is the true cost of teleradiology? Some NHS trusts who are unable to read some of their reports in-house for one reason or another choose to outsource that service to a high-quality teleradiology service using highly experienced FRCR radiologists. But others look for apparently less costly alternatives. Now, one of those apparently less costly alternatives, Tom, is to bring in locum cover. Now, I've got some figures later on which show that that may not be actually a less costly alternative, but are there any other problems with bringing in locums?
There are indeed. There are problems with language. You come to a strange hospital. You don't know how that particular hospital functions with the PACS and the RIS. So there is, a day, 2 days of training, which is wasted money because you're paying this guy to train him and then he'll perhaps work there for a week and go away. Whereas if you could switch over to outsourcing with specialist consultants, you can just save all that money straight away.
That's before we even look at the cost implications of using a locum. And yet when a hospital in Manchester decided to ask Medica, in fact it was, to provide their out-of-hours CT head and neck reporting. So they took that service in. They then went back and they assessed what the locum cost would have been. The locum cost would have been twice the cost of what the Medica provision was. So why would an NHS trust use locum cover? Bob, can you think of a reason?
I think where you have recently retired radiologists or radiologists who are winding down and know the trust, then there can be a reason for retaining the services of those people, and they may be paid on a basis which makes them look like locums. The question is whether they really are locums. They're not locums within the sense of the locum service that you're talking about. But there is some reason for doing that.
I think there are certain situations where you need a locum for interventional procedures. But for reporting cross-sectional, you don't need them. I mean, you just send the images to Medica. It's just so cost-effective.
Now, let's assume that you've actually got reports now coming in from a radiologist of one sort or another, but you haven't been particularly careful in how you choose that radiologist, and you've ended up with a report which is either incomplete or which actually reaches the wrong conclusion. Bob, I gather you are actually able to model some of the financial consequences of that happening. This will be fascinating. Can you take us through the model and show us some of the consequences of that?
The general way in which costs are assessed, of course, is not on the basis of the enterprise cost. It tends to be on a much more limited footing than that. So when people look at radiology services, they tend to look at them in terms of what it's going to cost the radiology department or the diagnostics department or whatever it may be, and not what the wider implications are.
Like they're taking a short-term look at what the cost is?
Yes, it's a very limited look at what the cost is. Okay. This is £2, that's £3,
that's
it's
right,
obviously a pound more expensive.
No, sorry, carry on. No. What they should be saying is who's the radiologist doing the reporting, not the cost. That should be the first question. Yeah. And that's what I've been saying to the guys, and they look at me as I'm from the planet Tsar, because it's the obvious thing to ask.
We looked at the effect of various facets of a service which is not the optimum service, and then we moved on from there. So, for example, we looked at the impact of a report which is not necessarily complete, as a result of lack of risk history, lack of prior images, lack of referral or clinical indications, and what the impact of that is, inadequate workstations, poor viewing conditions, tired radiologists with lack of knowledge because they're not trained adequately, and radiologists with lack of experience. Now, those are all the factors which we put into our model, although the idea of this model is that it's actually interactive. We don't put down the numbers for this, but we invite people to put down what they believe the percentage chance of an incorrect or inadequate interpretation as a result of those factors.
So a trust can actually take this model, put their own figures in and get the results out the other end?
Oh, absolutely. And that is the whole idea. I mean, why would they believe us? We would much prefer that they used their numbers. And the outcome of that is the fact that you can see out of, say, for example, 100,000 radiology examinations a year, you can see how many patients are actually impacted. And that's the platform then for the next stage, which is working out how much it's going to cost.
So what you've actually described is a chain of things that can end up in disaster. And it's so complicated that the average man in the street or the average doctor in the hospital has no concept about.
Well, that's correct. I mean, what we're describing is we're giving a slow motion picture of what happens when a bomb goes off.
Yeah.
You know, it's a very, very complex chain of events which spreads in every direction. And of course, nobody looks at it this way generally. So, for example, if you have 100,000 patients who go in for examination in a year, so what we're talking about is not a super busy hospital, but a reasonably busy hospital, or a diagnostics department of a hospital. If we associated really quite low percentage likelihoods of incorrect interpretations.
Very conservative here then?
Very, very, very conservative.
Okay.
So let's say you've got a 1% additional chance of an incorrect interpretation as a result of having a lack of risk history. You don't know what's happened before, you can't see the previous reports. Let's say it's 1% for lack of prior images. And let's say it's 1% for lack of referral or clinical indications. Let's say it's 3% if you have a completely inadequate workstation, one which you have no confidence in, that you can't demonstrate is adequate. Let's say it's just 0.25% because of poor viewing conditions. Let's assume that a radiologist's lack of knowledge has a bigger effect. And I've assumed a 4% effect there. But if you want me to take it down to 2, well, I can just enter 2 in and see what the effect is. And maybe a radiologist's lack of experience, another couple of percent. So really small percentage figures. The outcome is that out of the 100,000 patients, there are going to be 12,000 who are affected by these factors.
So it's a big number.
Yeah, it's a big number. It's a very big number.
Yeah.
But of course, it really becomes much, much worse when you start to look at what happens next. Because if you have a patient who has a diagnostic interpretation which is inadequate or wrong, then one of 3 things generally happens. The first thing that can happen is the fact that you need additional diagnostic tests.
More cost?
£75 a time.
Yeah.
Second, this is on average, obviously.
Right. Or a CT with 120 quid.
Of course, that's right.
We're being conservative, Tom.
Yeah, we're being conservative.
Okay. All right.
The second thing is that they can have lengthened treatment. And let's say 25% of people have lengthened treatment. And the third thing is you can have the possibility that the patient actually is not just inconvenienced and put to trouble, potentially distress, pain, but that the patient actually dies. So you have mortality on your hands. Let's say that's just 0.25%. And remember, that's 0.25% of the 12,000, not the 100,000. Now you can start to associate costs with each of those things. £75 for your extra diagnostic test, say £750 for your lengthened treatment.
Now that is conservative.
Oh, that is conservative.
Because these patients have probably been having the wrong treatment for a couple of weeks. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Taking the wrong drugs.
Yeah.
And say it's £500 if the patient dies, but that's really just for mortuary costs. It doesn't allow for anything else. And if they complain, they write a letter, then all of a sudden you've got your person who deals with that within the trust writing letters back. Maybe you've got your chief executive writing a letter of apology. That's another £300. And if you've got litigation, then you've got solicitors involved, another £3,500. And if the litigation is successful,
How high is that mountain?
well, I just said £25,000, but we know it's much more likely to be six-figure
I'm coming to
sums.
litigation costs in a moment, Bob.
Surely.
We'll cover that.
But given those facts and putting very conservative likelihoods on all of those things, what we're coming up with out of your 100,000 patients is an extra bill for £3.269 million.
More than £3 million.
Yes, but
because you employed the wrong radiologist at the top of the show.
It's because you saved yourself 50p on a plain film, or you saved yourself a couple of quid on a cross-sectional interpretation.
So what you're saying is quality saves money.
Oh, absolutely, no question about it at all. And the real thing is, I mean, 3.2 million, is that an important figure? Well, it's really the figure per patient that's the issue. That's an extra £32, not just for the patients that you got it wrong on, but £32 extra for every single patient that goes through the radiology department that has an exam.
So where is the saving?
Well, obviously there's none. Yeah, you're quite right, there isn't. I mean, in fact, there's a massive cost. What this doesn't do is it doesn't actually take account of all of the other things that can go wrong. So, for example, if you have a radiologist who's actually not located in the UK and something goes wrong, then you can forget these numbers. You know, and you're in a completely different situation then. And if you have a radiologist who's not under the jurisdiction of English law or UK law, and under those circumstances makes an error, and that is followed through by litigation, then who is the party that is going to be chased?
Well, I mean, none of us are legal experts here, but my guess would be the care provider is always responsible for the patient.
Well, you've got there much quicker than me, because my first thought was...
much quicker than me.
My first thought would be, well, it couldn't be the radiologist, because you've never nailed them down, because it's not under UK law. It's therefore more likely to be the private service provider, if it was being put out to an external private company such as ourselves. But then it seems very unlikely, because it's an entirely clinical error. So who's been negligent? And it rather looks like the care provider, as you say.
It nearly always comes back to the care provider in
It
law.
has to be
My
the
understanding
trust.
of the law.
It has to be the trust.
Which is a big risk. It's ever such a big risk.
So I think we're starting to find out what is the true cost, or perhaps we should say what's the true value of teleradiology as opposed to of quality teleradiology.
Another way of looking at it. Yeah.
One of the things that we know, which other trusts, for example, tend not to know as well, is we have a very, very clear idea of how many discrepancies are generated. And the number of discrepancies that are generated, and we generate a figure which we are very proud of because it's so low, nonetheless it would result in hundreds of potential legal cases.
Right.
I just think the risk is massive.
Well, just coming in on that, Bob, the threat, the possibility of litigation, I see that the NHS Litigation Authority has been forecasting what the NHS payouts for mistakes is going to be this year, and it's going to be more than £1 billion is their,
I can believe it.
is their forecast. You probably think that's a bit conservative.
Doesn't surprise me at all.
No. And a spokesman actually for the NHS Litigation Authority said it's getting worse this year, massively so. So the lessons seem to be there to be learned. Funnily enough, we did actually invite the charity Action Against Medical Accidents to come on and talk about this very subject. They weren't able to do it because of a date clash, but their chief executive, Peter Walsh, talked about the cutbacks. His view was the cutbacks are putting patients at risk. We are rudderless on safety. And he says, what is the human cost of all of this? We've been discussing the financial cost. There is a very human cost.
Absolutely.
I mean, all of the debate there has been about the government initiatives for changes in the NHS have resulted in a lot of criticism of exactly that sort. And the Department of Health have come back very robustly and said the primary factor in care delivery is patient safety. I'm just not sure whether that's being outworked at the moment.